We're going to be in John chapter 5 today. I had this moment on Monday. Monday we went to go see the baby. And I had this moment where I realized, I think maturity must come in like 3 stages, right? Like when you're an adolescent, unfortunately, that's how early it starts. When you're an adolescent, you begin to realize that your parents aren't as smart as you thought they were. You know, like when you're a little kid, you jump off the fridge, your dad catches you, he's Superman. Somewhere around 13, you realize he's not Superman. You start to get a little irritated with him. By 16, you know everything, right? You know how it goes. Stage 1, you realize mom and dad may not be perfect. Stage 2, usually, hopefully, by the end of your 20s, you go, mom and dad are just people. Like they did the best they could with what they had. I mean, they made some mistakes, but, you know, I can't hold it against them forever. And then you wise up and take responsibility for your own choices, which, unfortunately, happens less and less. I do a lot of pastoral counseling. Let me tell you, there's a lot of 50-year-olds out there still acting like they're 13. Well, my mom wouldn't give me my video game, so I was like, man, so I was like, nah, so I bought a Corvette. Right? Like, hopefully you grow out of that. Stage 2. And then your kids have kids, and you're staring at your grandkid and you go, oh my God, my kid went through the same process. He's in the middle of the same. I wonder if I'm still the idiot. I'm looking at that baby and I'm thinking, I wonder if they got to the point where they've forgiven me for being so bad at this already, or if I'm still waiting on that one. Jordan Peterson, I saw this video he did one time. He said one of the worst things that we tell young people is that they are perfect the way they are. You're good just the way you are. He says it's a horrible piece of advice. Because it's not, first off, it's not true. And secondly, like, if you're good enough the way you are at 17, 18 years old, where do you go from there? Right? Like, that's it. That's the bar. Like, that's as far as you're going to get. And the fact is we are all living a life where there is something inside of us that knows that there is something outside of us that's calling us to more. Not everybody knows to call it God. Not everybody understands that. This was C.S. Lewis's whole argument about how morality points to the reality of the faith. But the very fact that we strive to be better is an indicator that there's something that is outside of us that sets the standard of what is better. And if you tell people, no, you're fine the way you are, then what you're really doing is you're keeping them from the thing that they intuitively know is true, which is that there is something better. There is more. And we're always constantly in the process of a life of trying to figure out what that is. I'm not saying it'll make you happy, don't get me wrong. Solomon ever so eloquently said, as knowledge increases, so does sorrow. It's like, thanks for that pick-me-up. Hey, you know what you should do? You should study the Bible more. It'll make you really happy. No, it won't. It's, what is that? The Beatitudes? The Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn. What? Yeah, well, the more you know, the less you're happy. And yet, happy. Anyway, the point is, we're all striving, always, or we should be, to figure out who we are and who we want to be. And that is very much at the heart of the text today. And so since I didn't do a normal like prayer time type of thing, I just wanted to throw that out there. I want you to think about that while we read this text. All right? So John chapter 5. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which is 5 roofed colonnades, and in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." And Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath, so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" And they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, and there was a crowd in the place. And afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." And the man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." And this was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing, and greater works than these will he show him, so that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. For the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. And whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He has not come into judgment, but is passed from death to life. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself, and he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, and those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. If I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true. There is another who bears witness about me, and I know that the testimony that he bears about me is true. You sent to John, and he has borne witness to the truth. Not that the testimony I receive is from man, but I say these things so that you may be saved. He was a burning, shining lamp, and you were willing to rejoice for a little while in his light. But the testimony that I have is greater than that of John. For the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I am doing, bear witness about me, that the Father has sent me, and the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. His voice you have never heard, his form you have never seen, and you do not have his word abiding in you, for you do not believe in the one whom he has sent. You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me, yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life. I do not receive glory from people, but I know that you do not have the love of God within you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God. Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For you believe Moses. If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. And if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? That whole last part, Jesus sets that up with the first part, and we'll get to that. So there's a feast. Which one? Good question. This is really weird because John does a great job of telling you exactly which feasts Jesus is at in every other place in the Gospel of John except this one. No idea why. Now in John chapter 2, Jesus was at Passover, and in John chapter 4, when he's in Samaria and he comes back from Samaria to Galilee and he's doing stuff, and it says the people believed on him because they were also at the feast. It's possible that John chapter 4 is a reference to the Passover of chapter 2, and then there's another Passover in like chapter 6, and so maybe this is one of the feasts in between. It's on Sabbath day, so we know that Sukkot starts on Sabbath and ends on Sabbath. And we know that Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, they weren't even supposed to go to Jerusalem for that. They were supposed to stay at home. So it's probably not that one. It might be Sukkot, but there's really no way of knowing. Could also be Pentecost. The Jews were required, as you remember, to show up in Jerusalem 3 times a year. So it's possible it could be one of those. But nobody actually knows. Some people think it was Purim, because he talks about how God is at work and he's at work, and part of Purim is seeing God at work. But honestly, you could use that for just about any of the festivals. So here's my point. Nobody knows. Like most things in the Bible, there are areas that we are not given those details. Get used to not knowing. Like I can't put it any simpler way. There are some things that God has revealed, and he has revealed more than enough stuff to keep you busy for your entire life. But there are some things he hasn't revealed, and those things, just the way it is. So a lot of conjecture. Here's my thought. One, either John the Apostle was like, if I tell them which festival this was, they're going to totally miss the point. They're going to focus on the festival. They're not going to focus on what Jesus actually did, so I'm not telling them. Or John the Apostle wrote this book when he was so old that this was one of those moments where he went, I don't remember which festival that was. Which is an experience I have had many times already, and I'm not nearly as old as he was when he wrote the book. So, like, it could be either way. Don't know. Anyway, so he's there. He's at the festival but that's why there's so many crowds, because the festivals, everybody came to Jerusalem. So the place is packed, right? And he's at the pool called Bethesda. So it's at the sheep gate. It's under the colonnades. So we know that there was a sheep gate and there were colonnades, I guess, on the eastern side of Jerusalem. When Babylon destroyed the temple in like 500 BC, they didn't mess with the porch. It's called Solomon's portico. And they didn't mess with it. So it was still standing. And so it was kind of in disarray, but it was still standing, and it was cleaned up a little. So most likely that's the area that they're talking about. The problem is, you're talking about 2,000 years ago, nobody can actually pinpoint exactly where it was, or what it was for that matter, except that it seems to be that it was one of those like natural spring-fed areas where they had kind of carved out a space where the spring could fill up this pool with water, maybe about 8 feet long, and it was right next to the sheep gate. The word for pool is usually used for things like bath. Well, it's also used for watering trough. So it's right next to the sheep gate, which is where the sheep would come in and out so that they could sell them for sacrifice and slaughter and that kind of stuff. So chances are that's what it was. Probably not a great smelling area, if I had to guess. The perfect place to leave your invalids, right? It's like going to San Francisco. Like everybody wants to go to San Francisco, right? I mean, it's beautiful, sunsets out there, nice steep streets. Look, if you want to see that, just go to Pittsburgh. It's the same thing, only smaller, with less homeless people. Anyway, like San Francisco is a wreck now. People who actually live there are finally starting to go, hey, you know what? I don't know if I want people defecating in my streets and that being normal. But that's what they do. the sheep gate. They left the invalids there. Not exactly an act of kindness. Why? Well, in the ESV, it leaves out the second half of verse 3 and what's normally verse 4 in like the King James and most other versions. I'll explain why in a moment. That section tells us that there was a stirring in the pool that supposedly happened once a year, and they believed that there was an angel who would come and stir the water. And when the water was stirred, they could be healed. So when Jesus says to the guy, hey, do you want to be healed? And he's like, look, nobody's here to get me to the water when it stirs up. Now, admittedly, the invalid's statement about, the man's statement about no one being there to help him get to the water when it's stirred up, so it doesn't make a lot of sense without that section that's missing out of the ESV. But the reason it's missing out of the ESV is because the manuscripts that we have that predate 400 AD don't have verses 3b and 4. So as a interpretive decision, the guys who translated the ESV and several other of the more modern translations left that out because they said, hey, if we can't find it in the oldest manuscripts, maybe it doesn't belong there. So it does make it kind of hard to understand the whole story as it's being set up. But it's also one of those situations where it's like, what do you do with that? I'm telling you all about it, hopefully to make your brains hurt. No, I'm telling you all about it because I think it's important to have full disclosure, right? Like, you should know. The Bible is a collection of really old writings. We have more evidence for the scripture than they have evidence for like any other book in the world, except for the ones that were printed yesterday, but I don't know if I'd trust those either. Like nowadays, deep fake technology, you can pretty much fake anything. Like the Bible has more fragments of manuscripts than any other text. But when you start looking at fragments of manuscripts and you start trying to piece it together, there are places where there are things that don't come together as nice and as neat as we would all like. So whether that section was added in around 400 AD by a scribe or a monk or someone who was taking oral tradition and figured that they would help out by putting it in a transcript of the text, or it was put in because the superstition of an angel stirring the water made them feel good about it. Who knows? But that's normally what you would have read in a King James version, which gives you some context for what's going on. They believed the water would stir, and supposedly they believed the water would stir and you would be healed. Of course, there's nowhere else where that's mentioned in the Bible either, by the way. Like, there is no other story anywhere in the Bible of an angel touching water and then someone being healed. This is important because what happened? Before Jesus, they had no hope. They were all desperately lost and without hope. So what do you do when you got somebody who's an invalid? What do you do when you got somebody who can't walk, who can't use their hands, who maybe they can't see or they can't hear or they can't speak, they can't contribute to society, they can't take care of themselves? The ability to live on their own has been robbed of them. What do you do with them? You tell them a story about how everything's going to be okay. You give them a sense of hope that may or may not be true, and you stick them somewhere where you don't have to look at them anymore. And maybe it smells a little there, but it's better than them smelling in your house, right? You stick them off by the pool of Bethesda. What we do know from history is that the priests had a pretty good little system of pain killing going. They had their own pain clinic out there by the pool of Bethesda. So you come to the pool of Bethesda, you get your herbs, your spices, your salves, kind of deadens the pain. So maybe it doesn't feel so bad. I wouldn't call it like an opium tent or anything, unless you wanted to call it an opium tent. See, this is rough. This is the history of this. But it doesn't that sound prevalent to today? I mean, think about it. What do in the face of hopelessness? We drown our sorrows in alcohol. We drown our sorrows in drug addiction. We drown our sorrows in media. I saw a study the other day that trying to decide how to phrase this with the little ones sitting in the room. That the reproduction ability of young men, well, not just young men, but of all men who spend 4 hours a day watching TV is 33% less than those who don't. You want to know a great way to control population? Get people to binge watch TV. Like, that's crazy. Doesn't happen when you read a book. But if you watch TV, 33% drop, 4 hours a day. But what do? We look at a world that's just freaking crazy. Every time you turn on the news, they're screaming at you like everything's going to come down to a blazing fire. And you're like, I can't do it anymore. What's on TV? Let me binge watch Friends again. Let me watch The Office again. Or whatever it is that you're into. The opiate of the masses. Karl Marx thought it was religion that was the opiate of the masses. I would argue that Huxley probably was a little closer to how things work. And that's what was going on. The invalids were there at the pool of Bethesda, being taken care of. So when Jesus sees this man who's been an invalid for 38 years, and he looks at him and he says, do you want to be well? Understand, that's a huge question. You know, it's kind of like, it's very similar to like the way the welfare system is set up in the United States of America. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with this, because if you've been lucky enough to not deal with the welfare system, you probably don't know how it's designed to completely trap a person, right? So let's say that you qualify for SNAP benefits. You qualify for food help, food assistance. And they're going to give you $1,200 a month. That's really great. So you get your money, but then you're like, you want to work because you want to get off of the benefits because you were raised to be self-sufficient. So you go and you get yourself a job and you make $1,200 a month to get yourself a little farther ahead. And then the government takes the benefits away because you don't need them anymore. Except that now you're in the same spot you were before you started working. And so what happens is people just don't work. Because it's easier to stay with the benefits than it is to work and lose the benefits and not get any farther ahead. Instead of actually being designed to help people make decisions that will get them further down the road, that will help them to make their life better, the whole system is designed to keep you pulled in. And so the question becomes, do you want to be well? Do you want to be responsible? Do you want to be self-sufficient? Do you want to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and not lie to yourself about where you're at? Do you want to be able to go through your day and survive without downing a fifth of Jack? Like, what is it you actually want from your life? It's interesting, in the Greek, the way this is phrased, is, do you want well to be? The word want means determined, purposed. Are you determined to be well? Have you purposed in your heart to be well? Are you 100% sold out to the fact that you want this? It means something to you. And the word well is the idea of wholeness. It very much goes back to Deuteronomy 6. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, your soul, and your strength. Your whole heart, your whole soul, your whole strength. That idea of holy, of being a whole person who is wholly his, wholly given to him. The whole idea of wellness in the scripture is tied to that idea of wholeness. You cannot be healthy if you're not whole. But when you are whole, you will be healthy. That's why bitterness is rot to the bones, because what happens here affects everything else. That's why it is important for us to set our minds on truth, because when we don't think according to truth, and then our affections are not set on truth, and our actions do not align with truth, then it affects everything else. So it's the whole being. Do you want to be whole? Are you determined to be whole? Are you willing to give up everything else to be whole? And then that phrase, to be, genomai, it's the verb of being. It's that idea. You literally, it's the thing of becoming. It's easy to just jump through it because it's just to be. So what? To be or not to be? No, it's that thing of becoming. Like the way when a seed, you ever garden or hang out with people who garden or farm? Man, I hate getting dirty. Have I told you this before? You should know this about me by now. Not a fan of dirt. Yesterday, we were going to take care of some bushes, and it was a little like rainy and stuff out, and I was like, we can do it another time. And Matt Hutchinson shows up dressed to work, and he's like, nah, we'll take care of it. And I'm like, you don't have to do that. He's like, I already came to work. And I'm like, okay, fine. And so I grab my gloves, and I'm like, I'm going to go talk to him. But instead, I'm talking to somebody else. And I think it was Chris's fault, but I was talking to somebody else and about other stuff because I'm a pastor and that's the occupational hazard I talk. So we're talking, but I got my gloves. I'm like, I'm gonna get out there. I'm gonna help Matt. We're gonna do something. And he comes in like 10 minutes later. He's like, done. And I was like, what? I would have been at that all day. Dirt. Woe is me. So we move here to PA, and my wife is like, we're going to plant a garden. I'm like, oh, good. I know I should want to plant a garden, right? Because nothing tastes better than fresh tomatoes. Fresh tomato, nice big slab of tomato on toasted bread with some mayo, and that's dripping over the, oh. So I know I should want a garden, but who wants a garden? You know how hard those things are to keep track of? You got to till the ground, you got to clean the ground, you got to plant stuff, and then you got to watch for weeds, and then you forget about the weeds, and it grows weeds for like 3 weeks, and then you're out there for 8 hours on your hands and knees trying to pull weeds. You're like, this is horrible. You plant this tiny little seed, though. This tiny little microscopic seed, and you put it in the ground and you cover it up, and like a few weeks later it's a plant, and by the end of the season you have like food, like your own food. Like you don't even have to buy it at the grocery store. Like it's yours and it's in the backyard. It doesn't have any pesticides on it. It's not waxy and it tastes delicious, and you're like, where did that come from? It's magic. The seed becomes the plant. I mean, it was always there, but it needed the right conditions to become what it was always supposed to be. Do you want to be well? Are you determined to become whole? To be what God created you to be? And it's so interesting because this guy must have been there a while, because that's not the question he answered. He looks at Jesus and he's like, hey man, look, I'm here, aren't I? But no one's here to help me. And it's so interesting. And Jesus, there's a crowd of people there. How come this is the only guy Jesus talks to? How come this is the only one he heals? Again, we have no idea. How come he doesn't walk in there like a good preacher and tell everybody that they're wrong for waiting on an angel that doesn't exist? Why doesn't he go in there and start yelling at the priests for giving opiates to the masses? Like, there's a lot of whys that I don't have answers for. It's very frustrating. But I know that he looked at that man and he said, if you want to be well, take up your mat and go. Just go. It's that easy. Just go. Determine what it is that you want and just do it. I don't want to sound like Nike, but seriously, just do it. What is it that you want? Do it. You don't need to wait 6 months of strategic planning to decide to get up and take your mat and get out of here. Go. Do it. Do you want to be whole? Do it. Whatever's in the way, cut it out. Do it. Who do you want to be? Be that. When we trust Jesus, that's it. It's really that simple. Paul says in Romans that he does the things he doesn't want to do, and the things he does want to do, he doesn't do. And he's like, I'm a wretched man. Who will save me from this body of death? Because he recognizes that, yes, there is something in him that doesn't allow him to just do it quite as easy as he'd like to. But he also recognizes that it's not him. Are you going to struggle? Yes. Is it hard? Yes. To know who you are and who you want to be and to choose to move from here to here, is it hard? Absolutely. It is absolutely hard. You may struggle with physical issues. You may struggle with psychological issues. You may struggle with social issues. Jesus said, take your mat and walk, and it's Sabbath. Why did he have to take his mat? Like, think about that. What's so important about the mat? Go buy another mat. It's Sabbath. You're not supposed to carry the mat. Why? Because Jesus was poking the bear. That's why. He was poking the bear called the Pharisees. But you know what? That dude had to pick up his mat and go. Which meant that everybody was looking at him. Especially those Pharisees who were like, hey, what are you doing? It's Sabbath. You're not supposed to do that. You know what? Same thing. You may deal with social pressure. If you know that you're here and you want to be here, you may find that all of your so-called friends here don't want you to be here. Because as long as you're here in misery with them, then they don't have to accept the fact that maybe their life isn't the way it should be either. So they would rather you drown in misery than become better, because it prevents them from having to accept their own choices and the consequences of those choices. And if you're here and you want to be here, it may mean that you may have to go back to school. It may mean that you may have to devote yourself to a different kind of work schedule. It may mean that you may have to learn a new set of skills. It may mean that you may have to turn off the TV and read a book once in a while. It may mean that you may have to make different choices about different priorities. And the people who you surround yourself with, or the priorities that you've had in the past, those things are going to be like, hey, but we want you with us. We live in modern America, so like we were talking the other day about idols in one of the Bible studies. We live in modern America, and so we don't think in terms of idol worship the way they used to, because nobody's out there carving, like statues of wood or stone or silver and saying, here is your God. But you know what we do? We worship at the idol of sports scholarships all the time. That's not the only thing, but man, I gotta tell you, I cannot believe how many parents I meet who are like, I know church is important, and I know the Bible's important. I really want to get my kids back into church, but he just really needs to get that scholarship so he can go to college. Well, congratulations. He'll get the scholarship, and he'll never go to church again. Way to prioritize. Listen, I know that sounds harsh. I don't care. We prioritize all of the wrong things. Well, I just had to go to work. I just had to work more and more and more. I couldn't be there for that thing because I had to work so I could pay for that 10,000 square foot house. Because we all need to live in a house where everybody gets their own 20 by 20 bedroom where they don't have to even talk to each other anymore. No, downsize, work less, prioritize. Is a 10,000 square foot house sinful? No. Don't miss my point. My point is priorities. Where you place your priorities tells you what you value. And unfortunately, most Christians are idol worshipers. We value anything other than God. We value everything else except God. And sometimes we'll show up on Sundays when it's not too much of a bother, so we can hang out for an hour and do our Protestant penance of being berated by the preacher about how bad we are. And then we'll go home, we'll feel a little guilty for about 15 minutes until we remember that we signed a check so we could pay our dues for being there. And then we'll go home and we'll forget all about it. And we'll go right back to binge watching whatever's new on Netflix. Because those are our priorities. And then we say, I don't understand why God isn't blessing me. I don't understand why my life is falling apart. I don't understand why every relationship I have doesn't work. I don't understand why my children hate me. I don't understand why God doesn't really love me. And the whole time Jesus is saying, do you want to be whole? This is why after he takes his mat and he leaves, and the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, are like, who healed you? And he's like, I don't know. And Jesus finds him, and he says this fascinating thing in verse 14. It says that he finds him. Where is it? 5:14. Sorry, my eyes aren't seeing it good. Okay. Afterwards, Jesus found him in the temple, and he said to him, see, you are well. I told you, you're well. You're whole. You can be whole. You're whole. Now, sin no more, that nothing worse will happen to you. Now, the first thing that should jump out at you is you should say to yourself, wait a second, that's not how it works. Jesus says many times that the things that we do don't necessarily equate to judgment or punishment. The man who was blind from birth, the disciples were like, was it his fault or his parents' fault? And Jesus is like, that's not how it works. And the Apostle Paul says that we're saved by grace through faith, not of works. In fact, if there's anything that's clear in the scripture, it's that if it was about the things that we did, if God punished us in direct proportion to the ways that we acted, we would all be totally damned. We would be totally done for. Why? Because we don't do anything that's all that impressive. We all deserve way worse than what we get. We'd all be crawling around with a broken leg. Like, if God was punishing us based on a direct proportion to what we do, we deserve much worse. He's not transactional like that. But then that begs the question, well, then what does Jesus mean? First, you need to remember what the word sin means. Sin is the failure to rise to the standard of God's design for your life. I know that doesn't sound as cool as sin, but this is what it means. When Romans says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, that's the whole idea. God created you to be his image, and anything that you do that keeps you from rising to the place of being his image, that is sin. You have failed to measure up to the fullness of God's purposes for your life. It's a very broad scope of things. It's like you have to hit the bullseye on a target to get the bullseye. You can miss and get anything else, and you still missed. Like, if you came just outside the line of the bullseye, you missed the bullseye. And if you shoot the tree 40 yards to the other direction, you still miss the bullseye. Sometimes people sin and it's like, wow, that was bad. And sometimes they sin and you're like, how bad was that really? Like, come on, it's a little thing. Still sin. That's the point. But sin is a failure to measure up to what God's design for your life was. If you fail to take hold of God's design for your life, if you miss what he created you for, if you miss the point, something worse always happens. That's it. It's not some kind of spooky transactional thing where Jesus is like, hey, I got my eye on you. Don't screw this up. He's saying, look, you have the chance to live your life to the full. You have the chance to know God and to love God and to be fully alive in and through him. Just commit yourself to that. And if you will, life will be good. But if you don't, if you just talk the game, if you just go through the motions, you show up and bring your sacrifices and trample the courts, this is all going to go sideways on you. And that is something I have watched happen way too many times. I've been at this a long time. I hear a lot of stories. And I've heard a lot of stories. And there's so many people who start well and they just don't finish. There's so many people who have the greatest of intentions and no follow through. And sometimes you can look at it and you can distance yourself from it. You can say, look, I may be the pastor, but I don't have anything to do with this. But the fact is, it always hurts. It always hurts to watch people destroy themselves. And it's worse when they destroy themselves and they don't even know what's happening. They just walk right back into the same old pathologies, into the same old toxic relationships, into the same behaviors that are self-destructive, and they don't even see it happening. And you try and say, are you sure you want to do that? Are you sure you want to go there? Are you sure that's a good idea? And they're like, oh, everything's fine. And you're like, it's not fine. It's not fine. You could be whole. You can be whole. Don't go back. If you go back, it may be worse than when you started. It's like when Jesus tells the story of the demon who's cast out, and the demon's cast out and leaves and then returns and finds the mind, the heart of the man where he had possessed before to be clean and swept, nice and tidied up, and says to himself, ooh, look at that, it's empty. A perfect place to hang out. And then goes, gets other demons and comes back, and they all have a party in your head. You ever met those guys? Having a party? Somebody else having a party in their head? It's an interesting analogy. If you've had children, you know what that looks like. You know, you clean up a room, you clean up all the toys, you get everything nice and neat. Everything has a place, everything's in its place. And then you move on to the next room, and 15 minutes later you walk in there and you're like, ah! What happened? Maybe that's just me. Same thing. Jesus comes to love you and to set you free. And then you decide whether or not you want to stay free. Or if you just want to go back. Oh, Moses, if only we'd stayed in Egypt. Stuff was so much better there. How about you? Do you want to be well? Pray with me.